Hello, dear listener, and welcome or Jingiwala to the Indigenous Governance Podcast, a Trans-Tasman collaboration between Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, or AIGI, and the Community Governance Aotearoa. I am Regina Rogers. I am a proud freshwater Wiradjuri woman with strong ties to this beautiful saltwater Bundjalung nation. I am the CEO of AIGI, and AIGI is the Indigenous-led centre dedicated to advancing governance, knowledge and excellence, empowering our First Nations peoples through world-class resources and professional development.
Kia ora koutou, ko waio, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Porou, te aitanga mahaki, rungu whakaata me Ngāti Kahungunu. Ko Rosanna Hiha tōku ingoa, ko tūmu whakarai o Community Governance Aotearoa. Community Governance Aotearoa supports and strengthens not-for-profit organisations across the community and voluntary sector. This includes iwi Māori entities and organisations. We lead Kaupapa that supports great sector governance leadership in Aotearoa.
So before we begin, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands we recorded these episodes from and pay our respects to our elders past and present across all the beautiful lands where our listeners are joining us from today.
He puna mātou ranga kia ora ai te tangata, a source of knowledge to enlighten and sustain our people. At Community Governance Aotearoa, we honour the wisdom of those who came before us, the lived knowledge of today, and our responsibility to those who follow. Tēnā te mihi nui.
So in this podcast series, we're honoured to hear from the Indigenous governance leaders and experts as they explore Indigenous governance, nation building, and the pathways towards stronger, self-determined futures. We recognise that Māori and Australian First Nations communities bring a distinct histories, protocols, governing traditions, and lived experiences. So by learning from one another, we aim to support governance practices that reflect the unique contexts, priorities, and strengths of our communities. Through open conversation between peers, this series shares real experiences, cultural insights, and practical lessons from leaders who work within their communities.
Together, these conversations offer a powerful look at how Indigenous communities are strengthening governance and building futures grounded in culture, community, and self-determination. Enjoy the series.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to this podcast, Governing for Self-Determination. My name is Kevin Haunui. I'm a board director or trustee from Community Governance Aotearoa. I have over 30 years governance and operation experience in trusts, mainly at family level or Whānau level, but some experience also through community or Kaupapa trusts. Whether these trusts range from family land management, legacy estates to national queer community archives or advocacy at the national level or even regional level is where my experience in terms of governance has come from. My tribal links are Ngāti Tūwharetoa, Tūhoe, Ngāti Rangi, Ngāti Ūenuku, Whānau, Apanui, Ngāti Kahungunu, and Ngāi Tūhoe. Reira, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou katoa, e whakarongo mai nā I tēnei wā, kia hau. Me o kuhoa no the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, Yami Williamson, no reira tēnā koe, Yami, welcome, and how are you?
Thank you, Kevin. I'm very well, and it's wonderful to be with you. My name is Yami Williamson. I'm Ualiai. I come from northwest New South Wales, from a little place called Gaduga, and my mother comes from northwest Queensland, another little place called Cloncurry. I am a director of the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, and I have postgraduate qualifications in Indigenous governance from the University of Victoria in British Columbia in Canada, and also from the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona. I do governance training for boards of community organisations and also do training for community groups that want to incorporate. And I work with a vast array of community groups and organisations, from native title groups, PBCs, prescribed bodies corporate, range of programs, community controlled organisations and community health organisations, to name but a few. But I'm stoked to be here to have a yarn with yourself, Kevin, around this awesome and important topic.
I guess a good way of getting into this conversation, Dami, is to think about, well, what does Indigenous governance mean to you?
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I'll start, but I'm also really interested to hear your insights and perspectives as well. For me, I've always understood the context of governing in our communities to be quite different to the exercising of governance for non-Indigenous communities. I mean, the underlying factors that kind of define the context for Indigenous communities is just fundamentally different. We're talking about unique attachments to place, deep attachments to place, unique rights holders in contemporary context, that is rights to enjoy lands and waters, rights to resources, and rights to be together as a group and express a collective form of identity. So these are rights which Indigenous peoples enjoy here in Australia and elsewhere that I guess fundamentally sets groups apart from non-Indigenous community groups and organisations or traditional kind of Western corporations. And I think at the heart of it really is this question of self-determination, of what does it mean for a group to come together, to hold and possess a collective identity, and to exercise that collective identity through a modern corporation. Perhaps that's a good place to start on how it's different over here. And certainly strong commonalities with Indigenous groups elsewhere in the world. But I'm also really interested to hear your thoughts, Kevin, reflecting on your experiences in Aotearoa, working with Māori and iwi groups.
Kia ora, Rami. I guess for me, what defines Indigenous governance is actually a level of comfort, being in a meeting or discussing issues, whether it's family or community. And then when I mean comfort, I'm actually talking about cultural comfort. I'm talking about feeling that I am participating because of cultural recognition of who I am and where I come from, and how we place a high value on recognising what we call mana and authority of people around the table. So for me, Indigenous governance incorporates a level of making people feel valued and welcomed to the kaupapa, or the reason why we're meeting there today. And that governance is really important in that respect, in terms of setting up the framework for good, fruitful discussions. I absolutely agree that what also defines Indigenous governance is why we're there in the first place. And generally speaking, from my experience, most of it has been around land, the retention of land, the retention of culture, actually, but also the production of culture. Not just the fact that we have a culture, but the fact that our culture is changing all the time. Indigenous governance, to me, is looking at the world through Māori eyes, how we would see that world, and how we would look at solution challenges going forward.
Thanks, Kevin. That's a wonderful opening and giving some deeper insights into governance, or Indigenous governance, expression of Māori governance in Aotearoa. And if I may ask a follow-up question from that, because it certainly made me think, because you're talking about the attachment to place and about the governance of land, but also the governance, the reproduction of culture. And interested to ask what principles are entwined with that culture that guide decision making from where you're from, and also with the groups that you've worked with.
I guess some of the principles that come to mind, particularly what I mentioned about feeling comfortable and being able to participate. So what we call whakapapa or genealogy, those kinship links to people, to place, to the relationship between younger generations or generations that have actually passed as well. So those are important. And then there's the whole aspect of how do we maintain those relationships between people and maintain our relationships with the environment. So what we call kaitiakitanga, guardianship as part of those values. So these are things that are, I guess, rooted in the way that we look at governance. And then, of course, we have our customary practices, which we call tikanga, and that tikanga, and again, another way of looking at tikanga is what is the Māori way to approach this, what we're doing. And normally what that could look like is, what lessons do we have from the past? How does that relate to the contemporary nature of what we're looking at now? What are all the things that we need to consider? So it's a whole range of things, but they are contextual and relate to that issue at one point in time. So it could be a different solution to the similar problem going forward. But how about yourself? What do you think defines, or from your culture, you might add to our conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Certainly, the way that I've encountered the expression of governance in our communities in Australia, I think there's probably reduce it down to two common scenarios or two common kind of structural arrangements. The first one is place-based governance. These are usually groups that are bound together culturally or socially. There might be a group of traditional owners or various traditional owners from a certain region coming together to make decisions around land resource management, things like caring for country programs, and also negotiations with the state and other kind of third parties like mining interests or increasingly renewable energy corporations for development on their state. So that's one form of place-based governance, but another form of place-based governance are social groups people that have generally through the histories of colonisation and displaced communities have ended up residing in a particular place, in a particular town. And the story of how they've come to that place might be entwined with colonisation, and yet they share that township or region with other Aboriginal peoples and experience the same kind of systemic discrimination and historical marginalisation. And so you see groups forming around these kind of social groups, contemporary social groups. And they form things like Aboriginal Housing Cooperative, Aboriginal Legal Services, Aboriginal Health Services, youth programs, education programs, respecting the fundamental right that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that come to reside in a place, have a right for housing, have a right to access healthcare, have a right their kids have a right to be educated in culturally sensitive ways. And so I guess they're two forms or expressions of place-based governance. Of course, the diversity for it is extraordinarily different, but I think to understand those two common place-based governance scenarios, the kind of most governing organisations don't branch out too far from those central trees. So if they're place-based, the other one common governing arrangement in Australia is, and this is increasingly so, like political representation. So in Australia, we have a whole sector, in fact, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations and representative groups. Indeed, I'm here in the capacity as a director of one of them, of the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute. So these are groups not necessarily, you can think about them as being bound by place, being the continent of Australia, but not really bound by particular places or particular kind of cultural or even social groups at that local or regional level, but rather thinking about them as a coming together of communities of interest, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from vastly different places with vastly different experiences and exposures to colonisation, but that experience the same structural roots of discrimination, of racism, of sexism, of lack of access to opportunities or economic development. And you see these groups, you see these kind of common communities of interest coming together, forming their own organisation so that they might be able to represent the interests of the sector and of their particular stakeholders or shareholders, you might think of them as. And so you've kind of got this network of national representative organisations and sectoral kind of leaders forming around these common communities of interest, really for political representation. So I think here in Australia, thinking about these as different ways of forming and different reasons to form, different reasons of existing, whether it be negotiating with mining companies about the extraction of resources from country, whether it's about the delivery of health services, of culturally appropriate health services to social groups of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or whether it be about the political representation of certain communities and sectors to various governments and government agencies and other external stakeholders. These are the common ways in which I've always encountered our governing organisations, and I think it's each one of them has a different value proposition and a value add, and the diversity of them is incredible, and they're so rich in governance practices and expertise and ways of working.
Just wanted to follow up on that. And listening to your explanation, I was also thinking about the how place-based actually plays an important role from an Aotearoa Māori perspective. There are when I think about place-based and the types of governance that one might look at in terms of place-based, from a Māori perspective, the way our social groupings, contemporary, so forth, are built up is, so we have family, first of all, and family could be the nuclear family, the extended family. Then we have communities of families that might have a common either interest or something like that, but they're all based around a particular location as well. And then we have communities so that after the family or whānau, as we call it, we might have hapu, which is a group of whānau, and then we might have iwi, which is a wider, almost a regional-based group of connections. And generally, there's a connection back to what we call a waka and how people got to the place where they are. Thinking about things in that way, the governance, we then associate authority with that place-based community. So in other words, we recognise their authority within that area. And I guess there might be some similar kind of things going on in your communities as well. Now, with that, authority is a responsibility also for people who reside in that locality, whether they are Māori or not. Now, what I wanted to talk about there was that within Māori governance circles, then we therefore have tribal groups, and I'll use that term, tribal groups who have authority, recognised authority by other Māori. And then we also have other Māori within those tribal areas who may come together to pursue community interests as well. So there's a governance happening on not so much two levels, but in recognition of our cultural understanding of how we recognise authority culturally within that.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And I think that it kind of makes me think about the operation of governance here in Australia, particularly really being a practice stemming from the inherent right to exercise self-determination for groups. And I encounter this a fair bit when I work with organisations or communities and go and do governance training, that often I feel like there's frequently misunderstood or kind of unseen strengths of communities in the way that they come together, even before they come together and incorporate and form boards and manage budgets and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I mean, really, those things exist as an expression of the inherent self-determination of groups. And I think that self-determination begins with a group recognising itself or themselves, groups coming together saying we are bound by ancestry, we're bound by family, we're bound by culture and the legal traditions of our people. Here in Australia, we'd say we're bound by the dreaming of the ancestral stories and how people and landscapes were made. And, that continues to unfold in contemporary times as well. Other scenarios is, groups that come together that have been pushed together because of colonial practices of displacement and that have come to be together, have that common history of displacement or have that common history of a shared lived experience in particular places, where they be townships or even suburbs in some of our cities. And the third form of these political groups coming together, recognising each other and their common interests. The first act of governance are these groups coming together, recognising that they belong together in some way or another, and then making a choice to come together and kind of make it formal, and then by a group exercising their own kind of collective identity, well, then the recognition of that first comes from the other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups around the outside, groups that might recognise, yes, that these are people, a particular language group, they've been there for a long time, they are the traditional owners of those places, and therefore it's kind of this recognition of the rights of that group. And then, it's like, once it's predicated on those two things, a community recognising themselves and recognised by their peers, well, then they've got the kind of like the right and the ability to negotiate with the state and other actors. And so I feel like people think about how governance is a tool to express determination. It's like governance itself is an act of self-determination and of self-identification. And I think that not enough groups give themselves credit for that, because so much of the work goes into creating a corporation when people think the work begins once you've created it. And it's like, no, the work is in the leader. And the coming together, and groups that have that really strong shared constitution of why they came together in the first place, really, we see them, those kind of really strong foundations and understandings turning into highly effective constitutions, highly effective purposes of the organisations, and kind of directing their activities at later stages in a very targeted, specific and impactful way. I feel like there's already there's some things going on from Aotearoa in Australia that appear to be somewhat the same, but I'm sure the way that they come out and the exercising of it is also quite different. Interesting to think about it as both the same and different. So if we can think about modern organisations or corporations or local kind of tribal governments and the like being an expression of the self-determination of a group, I'm wondering, from your experience, Kevin, when you've seen groups do that really well, what have been perhaps some of their strategies, or how have they acted quite strategically to promote self-determination into the future? And as you said in the introduction, really focus on reproducing and transmitting their culture and their rights to future generations. Yeah, keen to know where you've seen it done well. What did it look like and what was the impact?
I think one of the examples that comes to in my mind is a large Māori authority, tribal authority, controls a large amount of land that was taken back from the government. And what I think has worked really well in my mind is that they've been able to communicate strategy, why they are pursuing a strategy that would benefit the descendants or shareholders of that particular organisation. So they've communicated those strategies really well. They've encouraged people to attend, annual meetings and so forth, to explain how things have gone on. So in my mind, communication has been really key in governance from this group as something that has highlights a success in terms of governance, I believe. And again, what I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast about feeling like I belong, feeling like I have a voice, feeling like I am contributing to decisions, all part of the way that this particular governance has been carried out, I think, in terms of making it both democratic in that way and inclusive, but also its task at the end of the day is also to manage the economic assets of the land. So to do that in a way that is always looking forward and providing opportunities for existing beneficiaries and children to leverage off what they can provide, such as educational scholarships and so forth. It's a bit of a roundabout way of trying to explain things, but that's the thing that sort of comes to my mind, and on a large scale, in terms of Māori governments that works well.
Yeah, thanks.
Are there examples that you can think of?
Yeah, there's a couple of examples where I've seen it done exceptionally well here. And one of them is actually with my own group, because we've come together as a native title group. So we've got resolution of our native title, well, parts of it anyway, in southern Queensland. And we're one of those groups that are split by the border. So we go over Queensland and New South Wales. And so the Queensland one's well progressed and the New South Wales one is catching up. But for our meetings, we're very, like our native title group, the Ualiai people, or the Ualiai Ualarai, prescribed body corporate, whenever we get have big meetings, bring people together. And a lot of our people live off country now. They live in the towns and the cities and along coastal areas. And it's usually quite a trek for them to get back onto country and to attend our meetings. And because of that, there's like strong attempts made by the corporation, but also just by people and families within the corporation to make sure that when families come back, when individuals come back to participate in sort of like the formal business, there's always opportunities for them to get out onto country. And so we see a lot of excursions planned. We see a lot of fishing adventures, camping adventures, a lot of visiting old sites, a lot of even sort of start to roll in some language programs around the times of some of our meetings, and always try and hold our meetings at times when it's convenient for people to get back to around weekends and the like, because if people are going to be travelling a long way to be there and participate, what a wonderful opportunity for them to bring their families back, to spend some time on country, to sit with some knowledge holders, to participate in structured language programs, to get out and enjoy the resources of country, do some hunting, do some fishing, that kind of thing. And so those softer attributes that happen outside of the formal charade of like an AGM or a large members meeting is honestly it's why people want to come and participate, why people enjoy coming back as well. And thinking about it practically in terms of its impact, well, we have a wonderful meetings and times to get together that are really restorative and provide healing for communities and for families in particular. These are groups, our group is like any other group that exists in Australia, have been really smashed by colonisation and displaced, and a lot of communities have had cultural connections, perhaps not severed, but certainly significantly frayed. And it's our job, our responsibility as a group and leaders of the group to make sure that we're re-threading the cultural fabric of the community around those who are already participating, and in particular around like their kids and their partners as well. So really embedding a healing framework in how we come together and the times we choose to come together and how we choose to spend our time outside of the meeting is just so, so important. So that's one way that I'm really proud that our group operate. But another really wonderful example through, I guess, being a professional in this field is there's not really one group, but a collection of groups that I'm aware of, a collection of community health organisations that over time got sick of how incoherent and how unreliable government are, whether it be changing departments, changing priorities because of a changing government, shuffle in ministers, different public servants coming in and out with different priorities and value sets. They got really sick of the inconsistencies and incoherencies of government. So what they did, this group of community health organisations came together and said, we'll stand as one. And we'll negotiate not as individual community health organisations, but as a collective group of community health organisations. Kevin, they did that about 30 years ago, and they still persist, and they've become such a significant provider of health services to such a significant portion of the Aboriginal community in that state. And we've seen over time this incredible phenomenon where they've been the most reliable partner in that jurisdiction. And because of that, government have actually organised themselves around this group. So the situation of being so sick of government changing their minds all the time, the kind of the moving structures of government, that they came together and they've become so reliable and so important that government, they kind of exist now as almost like a branch of the government in that jurisdiction. And as I said, when governments are designing health programs for Aboriginal people, they're usually the first group that they go to and they set the agenda with them. You know, the longevity of organisations like that, a simple idea expressed so coherently and so sustainably has had a dramatic impact on the standing of the health of their members and the political opportunities that they now enjoy, because of simply the idea to come to being sick of the way government operates, making a decision to come together and to fix government for them from the outside. And they've done that to wonderful effect. So yeah, a couple of different strategies, a couple of different, ways that groups have organised themselves for wonderful impact.
I agree. And I was thinking, and what you've raised in terms of challenges, for people to become involved where they are not on land or away from the areas or the thing that connects them. And I guess that's what the advantages of the meetings do have for families to come together, to connect, to reconnect to the reasons why the trust, so to speak, exists, or the body exists. And that is really important from a Māori perspective, not only that reconnection of people, but also reconnection to place. And so, for example, with my own Whānau or family trust of about 40 shareholders, so to speak, we have a particular way of running our meeting, and we also have a particular venue that we go to hold that meeting. And so through that venue, which is the marae, which is a customary meeting place for Māori, so, and for our family, this is where we come together and where the trustees and the trust holders come together. The way that we have our meeting is again an expression of our identity as this particular group of people. And so with this meeting, we will actually have a form of church beforehand, and which connects us to our past history. So, it's all very important for us to relive what connects us to the land and also together as people. And I just wanted to highlight that as an expression of continuing our identity, but it also then leads into how we self-determine how the land is going to be used going forward. So, again, we draw on our history, and the land where we are was considered a food basket. And so it's an important part of our collective memory that we hold on to and think about how we're going to use that food basket going forward into the future, which is actually going to be good for the social well-being of our group, but not just our group, but the land, and also for the people that occupy around that land, which may not be our group of people at all, but we're considering the wider environment. So all of those things are really, really quite important and continue to be important going forward. So I just wanted to also mention that, we have spoken about governance, and I guess there's several types that I'm thinking of from a Māori perspective. There's traditional governance, and we can then talk about transactional governance, which sort of relates to the reasons why people are there, whether it's for land management, whether it's for health purposes, education purposes, but it's a transactional type of thing. And then there's transformative governance. So how we going to use all of those things to make it beneficial going forward in terms of really the end game, which for Māori is an ends to an end of continuing to be who we are, and to exercise that authority, and to exercise our own determination around that. So I just wanted to highlight those three sort of governance types that we are contending with as Māori all the time. And I'm sure you'll be doing similar things.
Totally. Kevin, thank you for explaining it in those terms. I'm interested to ask you about the tensions that exist between those different forms of governance, especially the sort of the customary and contemporary performance of governance. Just really interested to learn about the tensions that might commonly arise in those different kind of expectations and of governance, and how groups have navigated those sensitively.
Indeed, that's a really good question. And I'm not too sure I have any good examples of that, except to know that they are there, and that leadership seems to me to be quite pivotal around creating the spaces where those three things can exist in tension, because the tension is actually a good tension, in my view, but always with the uppermost goal, really, of achieving transformational things. And one of the measures of what does it mean to be right from a Māori way of looking at things in terms of governance is to feel as if it's part of the framework of governance, in other words, customs and procedures, as opposed to being a tick box exercise or something that doesn't feel genuine or authentic in terms of its. So I think authenticity is a measure that I look at in terms of seeing whether things have been done in the right way. So that, that applies even to transactional type of dealings. We're not just thinking about the commercial end game, but we're also thinking about what are the other environmental aspects to consider: social, land, health, education. They can all come into the picture as well. And I'm going to say, let me think a little bit further and see if I can come up with an example for you.
Thank you, Kevin, for ruminating on that. I'm sure there are plenty of examples, and I might reflect on, I guess, a couple from here in Australia and some of the tensions certainly that I've come across in communities when they are coming together, whether it's just like a community group wanting to make a decision, a cultural group wanting to sort of set priorities, or a modern corporation seeking to, set their vision, purpose, objectives, and those kinds of things. I feel that unfortunately in Australia, but I'd also hazard a guess that it's quite common elsewhere, that we're really let down by kind of thinking that comes not from our context and our histories and our cultural roots around the modern performance of governance. A lot of the training that's provided to modern corporations is not really governance training, I would argue, but rather simply compliance training, financial training, legal, providing legal advice.
Yeah.
So I feel like our communities are really let down by, the training that's provided and the resources that are provided around how to do governance effectively or appropriately, because it usually represents a certain perspective of governance and what good or effective governance means. And those perspectives are usually not ours. And one of the ways I think that this has played out over time is that, certainly from the Australian perspective, I consider there to be a fundamental misunderstanding in the way communities understand their own governance, where they would see governance as something that happens in a boardroom and happens when you open a meeting and work through an agenda, when really governance, in terms of cultural governance and the customary governance that happens, all happens in the lead up to that. And there are these two continuing traditions of governance, being Indigenous traditions of governance, things like who is who in the community, how do families relate to one another, who carries rights and can speak over certain places or stories, who goes together, who belongs together, and who doesn't belong in place. What gives people the right to have a say? Things like knowledge, where has the acquisition of knowledge gone? How has it flowed? From who has it flowed? And what might it mean for people who carry that knowledge now? These are all such important questions and kind of act as various building blocks that hold up our governance houses and have done so for a very long time. And yet in the modern performance of governance, these things are seen as kind of distractions from governance. They're, often positioned as culture, or you might hear it being spoken about as kind of politics, and that they're undesirable in a governance context, in the performance of the duties of directors and the like, when really these things are so, so important and can never be lost in the duties of directors or the performance of various functions that a board has to exercise. And so, the tension for me, and how I've seen it come out, the tension exists between these kind of ancient forms of governance that have held our communities so well for so long. In Australia, we are some of the world's oldest cultures, and we continue to exist as specific groups, language groups or nation groups. We need to give ourselves credit that we know a little bit of something about sustainability. We know a little bit of something about transmission. We know a little bit of something about coming together effectively, harmoniously, making good decisions in the long-term interests of people in place. And yet we're told that through training and through resources and through how organisations are kind of monitored and evaluated, we're assessed on a very rigid, prescriptive form of governance measures that don't represent, or that don't necessarily represent, our governance measures. And so we've got there's a tension between these kind of Western and Indigenous traditions of governance, and how to wield them both effectively, because we must wield them both effectively. Just as we need to hold on to our ancient traditions, we need bank accounts. We need the ability to hold and possess money. We need modern corporations capable of negotiating with the state and other parties. We need to do that, and we need to hold on to these ancient practices and ancient governance formations as well. And I've always explained it as good groups who can do who do it well, find the right balance, of putting in the effort, having a modern corporation that's legally compliant, that's financially sustainable, whilst also upholding and sanctifying the ancient traditions that have held our communities together since forever. And ultimately, that's the cultural reproduction of communities, and the protection of our lands and waters remains at the forefront. And I think the tension exists when these two necessary governing practices are out of balance, when you see communities put too much effort into modern Western corporations and not enough protecting the cultural legitimacy and the cultural foundations of communities, or likewise communities that have sort of, prioritised the cultural governance in communities, perhaps at the expense sometimes of having modern functioning sustainable corporations. And I love it because that's where the self-determination comes in, seeing the whole system for what it is and choosing to deploy their time in some areas for strategic purposes. So I think understanding the tension reveals solutions. And for that, I feel like it's a very exciting time in the governance of all of our communities.
I agree. I think that the determining your own solution, your own direction and your own solution, and taking ownership of that is freeing from the perspective of you are not actually looking to necessarily at government or corporations or so forth to provide you with an answer, but they can become part of the answer, but on your terms. And so I think that's really, from a Indigenous governance perspective, is being very, very clear and having clarity around that, that both the vision and then how you achieve that is the thing that controls the tension of how you get there. I think that's a really, really important distinction in my mind in terms of what makes good Indigenous governance. It is that clarity of vision, it is that clarity, and then your strategy unfolds underneath that, but always with the intention that, yes, government probably have a significant, if not important, role to play in that. Also your local authorities, likewise. Also anyone who can become an ally towards that goal is with that. But the governance is actually around how you manage that tension, both within your stakeholders, which is your families, your people, the community, and then those people outside who can assist you in that direction. I think that's my way of trying to explain. I think also what you've just mentioned as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Really, really wonderful reflections and insights. I'd like to ask you now to look ahead, to project into generations, into the future, and how can you see governance evolving in modern Māori communities, and what excites you about the future of your communities, and where does governance fit into bringing that future to life?
It's a good segue, really. I think the youth of today, particularly Māori youth, are very, very confident and comfortable not only in their history, but also in the mechanisms of today and mechanisms going forward into the future, whether we start looking at AI, whether we start looking at how they'll communicate. They've got some challenges ahead to sort of work out how face-to-face becomes not so much face-to-face, because those were really important elements culturally of making decisions. But I think they're really well placed, and that's part of the progression in terms of Māori self-determination to and autonomy and having authority within that, and trying to work that out in this land that we live in, which is, in this colonised land. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity that youth have going forward to keep on progressing our pathway. I think what's going to be really vitally important is for youth to really also want to say, yes, we can do this and so forth. I guess it's always to ensure that we have hope going forward about what it is that why we aspire to be, still continue to be Māori, why we're not just not, otherwise what's the point? And so, I think that hope is really important. And so, again, how is governance important from that respect? I think for the youth, it's the opportunity to continue to apply the reasons why we continue to go forward, but to apply it in a way that makes sense to them, but also without leaving people behind, without leaving the older generation behind, ensuring that we're all continuing as one mind, so to speak. So I think those are challenges ahead, but I think they're also going to be that our youth are more than capable and are capable actually of doing that right now. And so also, how do we actually transition and succeed going forward, our succession going forward, to ensure that we've got a balance of older knowledge and learnings, a balance of youthful, not ignorance, but eagerness and almost like audacity just to forge ahead, supported by the ages in between. So we're all sort of working as one. I think that's a great vision to look forward to in my mind.
Thanks, Kevin. For me, I think about the opportunities of the future in terms of the challenges of the past. And I think about it even through my own family and the modern history of my own family. My great grandparents were sort of the first generation really to grow up in colonial Australia. Before them, it was kind of contact or pre-contact times. And so the journey of our family in modern times really there is definitely a beginning with my great-grandparents' generation. And then I think about my grandparents, my grandmothers in particular, the world that they grew up in was incredibly unsafe and, all-out assaults on Indigenous lives and livelihoods, my grandparents' generations. And so they kind of organised themselves and moved around the country to find pockets of safety, and that they did in their own communities, and that really formed the basis of modern communities, And then I think about my parents growing up, and my parents inheriting kind of like a collective sense of identity in modern communities and being politically free to advocate for their rights, to organise, to express their political opinions and to shake the colonial tree, as it would be. And they did to great effect. And from shaking that tree, it's kind of like specific rights have fallen out. And those rights then I feel like our generation's challenge is to organise those rights and to wield them to promote, to kind of organise our institutions, our modern organisations, our modern corporations, to use the rights and protect them, to sanctify them, but also use them insofar as we can and so far as it accords with our values, to promote economic development and community development, address a lot of chronic issues in communities, whether it be the lack of educational opportunities or the deplorable state of our healthcare or the incarceration crisis, like all of these various socioeconomic indicators that continue to define our contemporary communities. So really using the rights, organising our administrative structures around those rights to be able to advocate in strategic areas that we want to improve the lives of our people. And then I think about my kids, and I have 2, 4 and 7, and what they're going to inherit. And I feel like they are going to inherit the administrative and legal structures to be able to, stand on that governance stability and really start to be really strategic in what they want to strive for, because they will have the tools and the know-how to get it. And that really excites me. I've got great faith in younger generations. As an academic and lecturer, I get to teach young generations, and I'm so inspired by their intellect, by their strength of character and their political consciousness. You mentioned the word hope. I'm very hopeful for the future of our peoples. And, we see the world changing fundamentally before our eyes right now. And I think within the context of change for all, there are strategic opportunities for our peoples. And I really think our kids are smart enough to grab it. So that excites me.
I agree. And actually, I was just thinking about the way that governance has been developed in my family, and it may well have happened with many other families as well. But it's really about taking the kids to the meeting, and or when you go to meetings, the kids come along to the meetings and get to see what's happening in all its beauty and with all its challenges as well, in terms of how governance is actually played out, that the level that they've joined in with. And I don't think necessarily it's a matter of their choice, but through observation, they've learned. And that's their first introduction to governance, which I think is also a way that we have as Māori encouraged our involved, our children, our nephews, to hold on to those memories for when they get into those positions of choice around being involved in governance.
Yeah, amazing. And, Kevin, that's certainly the way that I grew up, wandering around meetings and being in community gatherings. You learn a lot. And I love being able to take my kids along to our meetings today. So it's a wonderful tradition that we continue to have. Kevin, from me, I just want to say thank you for all of your time and for sharing your insights. I've learned a lot listening to you, and I'm sure others will too. It's always wonderful to hear perspectives from our cousins across the ditch. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing so generously. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I mean, it's been an exercise for me. However, I really enjoyed it. And as you say, learning from cousins across the ditch, and I literally do have cousins who are from across the ditch who live in the area of Broken Hill. And so we are a blended cultural whānau as well.